Coming up on this episode, one day Gloria shows up at Andy's office and she volunteers to type a letter for him when Helen pops over unexpectedly. Uh-oh.
She's very pretty, isn't she?
Welcome to a special nostalgia edition of I Did Not Know That. Please like and subscribe.
Please stop saying don't forget to like and subscribe.
Sure, but how are we going to get followers?
First off, I want to thank everyone for watching this channel. It's just a few hundred away from 20,000 subscribers and now has 5.5 million views. So thanks for supporting my channel. Now let's get going. Andy Taylor had a number of girlfriends throughout the show's 8-year run, and I plan on doing a future program on all of them. Maybe we'll do a poll on who is your favorite. But if you're a fan of the show, you know he ended up with Old Lady Crump. Well, that's how Helen Crump was first introduced to America by Opie Taylor. I have to admit that during the show's run, I hadn't thought much about Helen and Andy's relationship on the show, but years later, as I revisited the program as an adult, I noticed a reoccurring event on the program. While aside from Barney at times, almost every one of the Mayberry main characters were pretty even-tempered and fairly mild-mannered. But there was one character who pretty regularly flew into full-blown rages, often over fairly minor events, and that was Helen Crump. Her rages usually seemed way out of proportion to the incident. So in this episode, we'll look at Helen and how she behaved around Andy when things didn't seem to be going her way. Our first glimpse of Helen was in the elementary school where she teaches. She'd taken over from a teacher in Opie's classroom. After we discover that Opie and some of his classmates apparently aren't up to snuff in history, he complains to his dad that Old Lady Crump has been giving him too much homework and he's having to memorize too many dates. And he tells Opie that he'd struggled with history too and told him not to get too worried about it. Well, Helen gets wind of this. She storms the sheriff's office unannounced, loaded for bear. And oh, did she lay into Andy over what turned out to be Opie misinterpreting what he had told him.
Ma'am,
When I took over this class, they were woefully behind in their studies. Well, Sheriff, I was just beginning to make a little progress. Just beginning when you came along.
Now, in real life, think of how this would have gone over. A newly hired teacher from another city storms into the workplace of maybe the most respected person in the community, raises her voice at him and chews him out over something that was in reality just a minor misunderstanding. In many places, that teacher might have been looking for a new job.
Just stay out of my business, please!
But apparently, the look on Andy's face that appears to be fear must be love. Because by the end of the episode, he's putting the moves on Miss Crump and finagling a way to walk her home.
That my kind of woman!
And so the romance began. To each his own, I guess. By the next season, Andy and Helen have become sort of an item. Helen and Thelma Lou want Andy and Barney to go to the movies with them, but Andy tells them they have paperwork to do and they'll have to finish up tonight and able to take them to the big dance tomorrow. But when Barney stops at the diner to pick up some food for them, he runs into those wild and crazy fun girls and foolishly brings them back to the office with him.
Hello, doll.
When Andy finally decides the best way to get rid of them is for he and Barney to give them a ride home to Mount Pilot, Thelma Lou and Helen just happen to be walking by and see the four of them leaving in Andy's squad car, and they are livid. The boys have no idea that the girls saw this, so when they approach them the next day, Barney and Andy are puzzled about why they get the brush off.
We're not going with you.
And then have their date canceled. They soon realize the girls must have seen them driving the fun girls home and jumped to conclusions. I know that's hard to believe. Neither girl wants to hear an explanation. We learn here that this will become a common dynamic in Andy's relationship with Helen. That good old, trustworthy Andy, despite having the heart of a Boy Scout, will always be assumed guilty, and that she'll always assume the worst about him and stomp off in a rage. And he even tries one more time to explain
Don't you want to even hear an explanation? What? Well, all right then.
But Barney, being Barney, actually brings the fun girls to Andy's house and the dance to teach the girls a lesson. It turns out the girls have dates of their own, Goober and Gomer. Andy gets to dance with Helen, and she finally gives him a chance to explain what happened. To her credit, she does tell him she's sorry, and
You're pretty, you know that?
boom, they're back together. So after they've been dating for a while, Andy is innocently strolling down the street one fine Mayberry day
Helen?
when the next thing he knows, he encounters Helen.
Wait,
And she
What's going
is
on?
I should
furious.
think you'd be the last person on earth to ask that.
She thinks Andy has done something terrible again. The night before, she had learned that Andy was up to no good. This time, and get this, he apparently was telling people he was going to marry her. That Andy, what a jerk.
I don't like going to a PTA meeting and suddenly finding out that I'm engaged to the great Sheriff Taylor.
She lets him have it with both barrels,
Think you are, anyway. Mayberry's answer to Cary Grant.
never lets him defend himself, and surprise, surprise, storms off in a rage. Of course, Andy never told anyone that they were getting married, and you can have one guess who the culprit actually is who did it. In fact, Barney had done something similar in an earlier episode, so you'd think that that might have occurred to her. Andy has to basically force his way into Helen's house to explain that he was innocent. By the end of the episode, we have the two back together again, and Helen tells Andy she has made a wish that they'd marry in June.
What?
Later on that season, Aunt B has invited Gloria, the daughter of a longtime friend, to stay with them for a while. She'd been engaged and it fell apart, and she wanted to get away from the situation. There was about a 10-year age difference between Andy and Gloria, and Andy said he doesn't even remember who she is. When she arrived, she, of course, is grown up now and is a beautiful woman. As the episode goes on, Andy and the Taylor family try to cheer her up. One day, Gloria shows up at Andy's office, and she volunteers to type a letter for him when Helen pops over unexpectedly. Uh-oh.
She's very pretty, isn't she?
Andy and Helen have a movie date that evening, and Helen comes over before the date to have dinner. After Gloria's former fiancé attempts to reach her by phone, Gloria won't take the call, and she's visibly upset. Andy, being the nice guy that he is, feels bad for her and invites Gloria to join them at the movies.
Well, why don't you just come and go with us? You don't mind, do you?
Oh, no, not at all.
Andy, have you learned nothing?
How long's she gonna be here?
I'll get her a date.
Which does not go well at all. They set up Gloria with Goober, and after she turns down Goober's suggestion that they dance, Goober grabs Helen and dances the night away. Gloria pulls Andy onto the dance floor to teach him how to dance, and you can imagine how well that went over with Miss Crump.
Will you wait a minute?
I said good night, Andy, good night.
Well, will you be reasonable?
Reasonable? Again, Andy, have you learned nothing?
From now on, go out with her alone. I don't have to stand around and watch.
But in this case, Helen's radar seems to have been right. Gloria thanks Andy and kisses him on the cheek, which catches him off guard and seems to make him aware of what was really going on with a little help from Aunt B. Andy finally resolves the situation by arranging Gloria's old fiancé to pay a surprise visit to his home. And it worked. And Andy's back with Helen again. After all, why would he have wanted a beautiful, well-adjusted woman when he has Helen? There's a lot of irony in the next episode that we'll look at. Helen's working on a project with a member of the school board, and Andy had assumed it was a woman. It's not. It's a sophisticated, tall, dark, and handsome guy named Frank. Dr. Frank. And he seems to be better at everything than Andy. Even the guitar. As the episode proceeds, the project they're working on takes up more and more of Helen's time. The tipping point is when she breaks a movie date with Andy, so he goes to the show with Goober. They decide to stop by the diner for a bite to eat, and guess who they stumble upon sitting right next to each other on the same side of the booth, looking pretty cozy. Even Goober realizes the situation is questionable.
I always thought to close the school bill at 7 o'clock.
To make it worse, Frank and Helen appear very awkward and embarrassed, like they've been caught doing something that they shouldn't have been doing. Andy doesn't look pleased. He's hurt and a bit upset about it, and he confronts Helen later. And of course, she profusely apologizes and tries to make things right. Actually, she doesn't. She goes into one of her by now famous rages. Instead of relating to how Andy may have felt, she focuses on his word choice, run with. Because how dare Andy be so vulgar?
And if you insist on referring to going out with somebody by such a vulgar term as running with,
He has no right to question her relationship with Frank, and
I will decide with whom I will and will not run.
she'll run with who she wants to run with. As Mount St. Helen continues to erupt, Andy solves the problem by kissing her to stop her raging. Now everything's hunky-dory again.
That's not going to solve anything.
Okay, I actually had a few more clips to look at, but I usually don't go this long, so let's just do one more. If you guys want me to do a sequel to this, let me know in the comments below. So the last one we'll do in this episode is where Helen gets ticked off that Andy has taken a photo with a movie star named Darlene Mason. Yes, a movie star. It seems Hollywood is going to make a film based on Andy called Sheriff Without a Gun. So Andy, Opie, and Aunt B fly out to Hollywood so that Andy can give some input on the film. Andy meets the beautiful female lead for the movie, and the publicity department wants to take some shots of the two of them together. Andy's very uncomfortable with it all, but they loosen him up and finally get some pictures. And wouldn't you know it, one of the photos ends up in the very newspaper Helen is reading. At this point, I don't need to explain what happened. One thing that's a bit different this time is that Andy finally gets fed up with Helen's insane jealousy.
He's a very nice person.
Well, if she's such a nice person, what are you waiting for? I'm sure you'd make just a wonderful couple. Goodbye.
Wait a minute.
And decides to go to dinner with Darlene Mason, the movie star. But before they even make it out the door, good old Andy feels guilty and has Darlene Mason talk to Helen to assure her there's no funny business going on. It did have kind of a funny ending, though.
To tell you the truth, Darlene's been just like a sister to me.
What was that?
So how do you explain the character of Helen Crump? As most of you probably know, there were things going on privately that explain why she was able to catch Andy and the other women on the show couldn't. Andy Griffith has mentioned that he and the writers for the program just didn't know how to write for women. Hence the ever-changing women that came and went throughout the show's run. Maybe that's why they kept on repeating the same scenario with Helen. She suspects Andy of doing something wrong, refuses to let him explain, flies into a rage, and angrily stomps off. Then Andy explains it all, and they're back together again. Every show needs a conflict to keep it interesting, and Helen's tantrum sure brought conflict. But the repetition can also become a bit silly at some point. Regardless, you have to admit, whether you like the character of Helen or not, actress Annetta Corso was very good at pulling her top and chewing Andy out. I'll bet she enjoyed being able to do that. Well, that's the end of this one. Hope it wasn't too long for you. Like I said, there are more episodes of Her Going Mount St. Helen. And if you want a part 2, let me know. I'm looking forward to the next time we'll get together again.
Blah, blah, blah.